All right. Theory's great, but sometimes we got to get down to the nuts and bolts when we're reading literary texts. So here, looking on at our venture here in this video, is I.A. Richards, legendary literary critic. We talked about him briefly in the New Criticism episode. And he wrote a book called Practical Criticism, which is what we're going to be doing right now. We're going to talk about the just nuts and bolts, basic terminology. In this video, our goal is for you to get your terms right and make sure that you're using author, speaker, voice, narrator, persona, character, that you're using these terms accurately in the way that professional literary critics and literary scholars use them. This is a Literary Criticism Practical Explainer. I'm Dr. Jonathan Newman, and this video is in part in response to a discussion that I had with my students in English 235, and I'm hoping that this can, for them and for everyone who's watching, clarify how literary critics use these terms. So let's begin. When you're reading a book, a poem, a text, who do the words you're reading belong to? Or, if you're a prescriptivist, to whom do the words you're reading belong? Same diff. Well, you might say, well, of course they belong to the author, right? The author wrote them. But, you know, when you're reading a text, it's not, maybe the author isn't speaking as themselves. And so we use the term speaker, right? When we're reading a poem or something like that. And sometimes we might use the more specialized term persona. We might use to describe the quality of the words that we're reading. We might use the word voice. You'll encounter this term in literary criticism too. And of course, there's also our friend, the narrator. And sometimes the words that you're reading belong to a character who's speaking them. So how do we distinguish all of these? What do they mean? What is their relationship with each other? I'm going to take us through this very simple, through these distinctions between these terms in order to clarify how they mean and what their relationship is to each other. So first, let's begin with the author. What is an author? Now, this is a more complicated question than you might think, but we're gonna hold off on the kind of theoretical explorations of what is an author for other videos and when we get to like post-structuralism and stuff like that. For now, let's just say the author's the real person who wrote the text. Whether it's somebody we know who's still alive or some anonymous medieval poet, there is a real person who presumably wrote the text. That person had a unique identity, life experiences, and intentions, right? They also had their own biography, their own personal experience and historical context, and these can influence the creation of the text. In this class, we're going to be reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight soon, and so we can expect that the author had a certain understanding of chivalry and medieval Catholicism and so on and so forth, connected to their identity, their role, their experience, and their education. The author and their work, however, are not always directly connected. So authors can use pen names, like the time J.K. Rowling wrote that mystery. They can use pseudonyms, right? They can purposely create separation between the real person who wrote the real person, the kind of extra-textual person, and the kind of idea of the author that they attach to their text. And then we're going to get into some tricky business there, but this is good enough for now. The author is outside the text in a sense, but yeah, that can be problematized, but we're not going to do that right now. Authors also can have diverse styles and genres that diverge from their personal lives, and they can have multiple styles and genres. Like I think like Stephen King is another example of a popular author who has written in other genres under other names, and it's quite common. There's a lot of mass market popular writers will write in multiple genres and different styles. I'm thinking of like MC Beaton, the British mystery writer, who will write in different names depending on whether she's writing like cozy mysteries or thrillers or what have you, because the name of the author becomes associated with a certain expectation that readers have. But oops, let's save that for the reader response video. We also have the speaker, right? You'll sometimes might want to use the term speaker when you're writing about a poem or some other kind of text. A speaker is a distinct entity within the text. That the speaker can convey the narrative, right? The speaker can be the storyteller, They express thoughts, emotions, and ideas, their own. Sometimes they're identifiable with the author, sometimes not. So when we're reading a confessional poet, for instance, like Sylvia Plath or Robert Lowell, then there is a very strong connection between the extra-textual identity of the author and the speaker within the text. Walt Whitman, I think of as another author who's very much like, I'm Walt Whitman, I'm writing a poem, these are my words. But there are other poets, like, for example, T.S. Eliot, right? We read last week The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and that is very much a poem where he does not write as himself, T.S. Eliot, but puts on a different kind of persona. We'll get to that in a second. But speakers have their own voice and perspective, and they can be distinct from that of the author. And the speaker is how we identify the person who's talking with us in the text. And for example, like in the Edna St. Vincent Millay poem, I Being a Woman and Distressed, if you can't really with evidence, assert confidently that Edna St. Vincent Millay is expressing her own personal, real experience, then you're on safer grounds to use the term speaker than author when you're writing about the speaker's attitudes or feelings or emotions in that poem. And the speaker shapes the way the story or message is presented, that notion of personhood attached to those words. And the speaker can be a character within the text, or they can be a detached observer narrating events. So you can think of like a Nick Carraway type character in Gatsby who is in the text but kind of detached, but he's speaking, he's telling. So there are different kinds of speakers, right? There's the persona, which we talked about already, as the kind of person that persona comes from a Latin word, going back to Old Etruscan actually, that means mask. So there's a sense in which the persona is a mask that the author puts on. It's a specific role or identity or character that a specific role or identity that a character or speaker adopts within the text. Again, a persona is a kind of fiction. It's something that's, in a sense, fabricated. The persona may or may not reflect the author's own beliefs or identity. T.S. Eliot wrote Prufrock when he was like 19. So the kind of like middle-aged, like world wariness of that we find in the speaker of J. Alfred Prufrock is a little put on for a 19-year-old. Although, Anyway, authors often use personas to explore different perspectives or to distance themselves from controversial or personal subjects. A persona allows for creative exploration without necessarily representing the author's true self. Now, a persona is generally a term that is often associated with poetry. We can also talk about narrator. Narrators is a different kind of speaker. And a narrator is associated with, obviously, narrative. We associate it frequently with fiction, although there are narrative poems as well, like the Iliad, for example, or the Canterbury Tales. And the narrator is a specific type of speaker within the text responsible for narrating, for telling stories specifically, recounting events, shaping the narrative, describing events and characters and settings and all the things that happen in narratives. The narrator is not necessarily the author. They can be a character, again, The Great Gatsby, or they can just be an abstract voice, a kind of, we'll learn later on, we'll discuss narratology in another video, but what's called an extradiegetic narrator, a speaker who's not a character in the story. The narrator determines the perspective from which the story is told, and some of these distinctions you might be familiar with already, especially with creative writing people. Reliable versus unreliable narrators, omniscient versus limited narrators. Some narrators are objective and some are biased, right? Some clearly have a horse in the race when they're telling a story. And also, it's important to remember that narrators and authors can have different intentions and worldviews. I think there's a reflex these days, especially in kind of online discourse about books, to always attribute every worldview that gets expressed in a book to an author. I just think that's sloppy thinking, personally. So another kind of speaker is a character, obviously. And a character is a fictional figure within the story, major or minor. A character has distinct personalities, motivations, and roles in the narrative. And a character is something we usually use to speak of fiction after the Renaissance, or fiction since the rise of the novel. It's really something that we associate with the idea of the novel. The word character, actually, back in the Renaissance, meant handwriting. So somebody's character was how they wrote. It's related to a word for letter. And so there's the idea that just like everybody's handwriting is distinct, a character is like a person's distinct kind of signature, right? And characters interact with each other and the events of the story, driving the plot forward. They are created by the author so that the author can tell stories. Sometimes characters also tell stories, right? Whether sometimes you have an intradiegetic narrator who is a character in the story telling either their own or somebody else's story within a text, or you can have like a frame story, again, like the Canterbury Tales or the Boccaccio's Decameron, where different characters are telling other stories, not necessarily ones that they're in, but just telling stories, right? And so this is another kind of speaker, the character. Now, what is this thing called voice that we sometimes hear about when we're reading literary criticism? Well, voice is something that connects to all of these different types of speakers and characters, narrators, personas, whatever. The voice is the unique style, tone, and manner in which the narrative or text is presented. The voice is a term that we use to attach qualities to. It encompasses the author's writing style. That's one way we can talk about T.S. Eliot's sort of learned and kind of dispassionate voice versus and St. Vincent Millay has this educated and intellectual but also sort of passionate and personal and self-disclosing voice. And so the voice encompasses the author's writing style, the narrator's tone, and the overall atmosphere of the text. So the word voice is a little bit vague, but its vagueness makes it useful, right? When we talk about a speaker, the voice is a term that we use to attach to the answers to the question, how does this person sound, right? It's a literary tool, and it can vary between works of the same author. The voice contributes to the mood and the emotional impact of the text. It connects to how we experience the text. So, who are we hearing when we read? Well, the answer can be any of these, and they can be interrelated, right? An author will speak as themselves. We will get authors that are, there's some overlap. How we use these terms depends on our focus and our purpose as a critic, right? If we're looking at how a story is constructed, we might focus more on issues of narrator and character. But if we're reading poetry, for instance, and we're interested in the emotional impact and mood of a poem, we might focus more on persona and voice. And remembering that speaker is a broader term that can encompass persona, narrator, or character, and that we can use the term voice to talk about how the speaker sounds. Persona is more common with poetry, narrator and character belong to narrative, and voice refers to the quality or kind of tone, register, mood, etc. of the speaker's language. I hope this video has cleared things up for you a little bit and that you can go forward using these terms with precision and confidence. Thank you for listening. Bye.